Hi, I'm Hetvi and I'm going to present our poster paper for GECCO2021. I'm grateful to the ACMW scholarship backed by Google to enable me to attend this conference. So motivation for the problem that we're trying to solve. Keratin, a protein found, a very common protein, one of the smallest proteins found in humans, is about 550 amino acids long. So out of 220 raised to 500 possible combinations, nature somehow stumbled upon this particular sequence. And to put things in perspective, 10 raised to 80 is approximately the number of atoms in the universe. So it is definitely not tractable to explore such a large space. So we're just trying to answer the question of how exactly nature reduces this exponential possibility to weed out potentially good combinations. In a sense, evolution is learning what's fit and what's not, enabled by some constraints. These constraints are known as priors or inductive bias, and they typically represent selectivity towards low complexity structures. Existing approaches which seek to incorporate such priors in their genetic algorithms are the first based on learning theory proposed by Boolean in 2009, and the second based on metabiology proposed by Kite in 2011. Our goal is to propose a common simulation framework to examine how these different priors affect the notion of evolvability and how they might be related to each other. In the first setting, evolution is modeled as a learning problem guided by aggregate fitness. The constraint here is restricting the search space to a chosen class of functions that we are evolving to. So simpler classes like conjunctions are shown to be more evolvable than more complex classes like parity functions. The second setting imposes the universal distribution over the mutation neighborhood, which means that probability of picking an algorithmically simpler structure is exponentially more. So we are essentially biasing the genetic algorithm towards simplicity by imposing a probability distribution on the mutation neighborhood. So this probability distribution can be thought of as a soft constraint on the neighborhood, whereas in the Boolean setting, we have a hard constraint on the mutation neighborhood because it is like a yes-no type of thing that yes, it is either in the function class or it is not in the function class. So we are trying to translate the notion of the hard constraint in the Boolean sense to the soft constraint in the Orozco et al. Sense. What we do is we propose a restriction on the algorithmic information of individual. So our prior here becomes a threshold on the Kolmogorov complexity of the individual approximated by the block decomposition method value, rather than this idea that they have to belong to a certain function class. Of course, the question which arises is that can the hard constraint in the sense of belonging to a certain function class be emulated using a threshold on the information content? Simulation suggests that that is correct. So it follows by the definition of Kolmogorov complexity that parity functions and conjunctions would definitely have Kolmogorov complexity lesser than just any random individual. But what is especially interesting here is that even conjunctions and parity functions in and of themselves are seem to be separable by a threshold. And that is really interesting because in the learning theory analog of things, we also have this notion of conjunctions being simpler than parity functions. So in that sense, our thresholded setting does seem to be a plausible hypothesis to make. What we to dive into what we exactly mean by it. So consider this example. So we start evolving from X and not Y, and we set the threshold to be 8.3 bits. What this means is that every individual in, so every mutation in the mutation neighborhood whose BDM value is greater than 8.3 bits is excluded from the mutation neighborhood. So only the green boxes form the ultimate mutation neighborhood. So what do we see? The first thing that we observe is that for the full BDM distribution, convergence is rapid. There are no timeouts, and even the selected individuals have a BDM value which is considerably very less compared to the other two settings. What we observed for our thresholded setting is that applying a threshold seems to act like some middle level or some middle intensity prior, in the sense that we have BDM which is less, which is relatively less than when we don't have any such prior on the information constraint, and we also have a small but significant increase in the speed of convergence. So we can interpret this as the universal distribution being is a very strong prior, and we are trying to emulate this very strong prior by imposing a slightly less stronger prior of the BDM threshold. So we observe that as even as the threshold becomes tighter, we have faster convergence. So in some sense, we are tending towards the soft threshold case. But extinctions and timeouts increase rapidly in this case, especially for parity functions. And one more notable thing is that throughout our experiments, conjunctions converge considerably faster than parity functions, which is consistent with the hypotheses of both of the frameworks. So in conclusion, we can say that the threshold is a weaker form of bias than the full universal distribution, but it still leads to a notable speed up. We think it is not plausible to assume knowledge of a distribution over an exponentially large space, which is why restriction on realizable functional mechanisms like conjunctions may be a more plausible constraint. Further directions include questions like a feasible way to tune the BDM threshold and exploring modifications of the representation space, because currently we are only looking at the time complexity of things and not the space complexity, but that is also something that should be considered because in our current experiments, the space complexity is, so for every n variable function, we require 2 raised to n bits, which will not be tractable for higher n. So even that is a further direction that we are working.